Why use the word tortuous when you can use the word complicated? Both communicate the exact same core concept. They mean almost the same thing. They're synonyms. In fact, most people might prefer using the more simpler option than the more complicated or less used one. So does the use of an obscure word, the choice of using an obscure word or a more simpler, more commonly used one, add any structural value, or is it just stylistic arrogance? In modern literary discourse, writing using dense vocabulary is increasingly viewed as a performance of intellect. A writer flaunting their historical jargon at the expense of accessibility. To some, demanding a high level vocabulary is simply pretentious, and to some, entirely exclusionary. This brings us to a fundamental divide in contemporary reading culture. Is modern reading comprehension undergoing some sort of systemic decay, or are writers engaging in elitist gatekeeping? Before we move ahead, I want to make my stance on this entire thing pretty clear. As a writer's choice of language, words, and whatever artistic choice in terms of writing is entirely their own. As a writer, I do not want somebody I do not know or have never met telling me how I should be writing and what words I should and shouldn't be using. Especially in a world where literally every reader carries a dictionary in their pocket, their demand that literature and writing be dumbed down, made simplistic, flattened for easy reading feels like a lack of curiosity on the part of reader, a lack of curiosity to learn from these words they do not know. If you, as a reader, encounter a word that you do not know is unfamiliar, then look it up. It's as simple as that. The friction of learning is part of the reading process. However, this friction itself, I think, is what the modern market is fighting against. Today, we need to dissect what happens when dense vocabulary meets an algorithmically trained audience. What does it mean to demand effortless prose? And how the shift towards such frictionless reading is fundamentally altering the contract between the author and your audience and the readers. So grab your coffee, tea, or whatever keeps you sharp, and let's head down to the courtyard. This entire discourse reached a boiling point when readers actually started to make videos about it, coming out on social media asking authors to not use complicated words. They would point out instances where authors have done so in their books and then be like, please use a simpler word. We can't handle this. What is this? Please use like a simple word. And of course, anytime there's an opinion, anytime there is a take, there's a counter argument, and this the counter argument towards the use of simpler words or not using simpler words, was fixated on the global literacy crisis. But I think attributing this entire shift entirely onto one single thing, and that's literacy crisis in terms of language, reading comprehension, and all of that, I think it misses the real economic and cultural sort of engine that's actually driving it. Every reader, irrespective of their reading level, will eventually encounter unfamiliar vocabulary, will eventually encounter a word that they do not understand and they do not know. So the issue, I think, isn't entirely that readers can't process low frequency words. It's not just that. It is that contemporary market no longer values the effort required to understand such words, the effort required to do so. The widespread demand for simpler prose has less to do with illiteracy and everything to do with the commodification of reading as a form of entertainment. Literature has stopped being a process of learning. It's not consumed as some sort of way of learning. It's now viewed as a passive mechanism to unwind. People come home or take their time to sit down, grab a book to read for fun and read for entertainment. This also explains the entire hyper formulaic trope heavy fiction that's taken over the literature scape these days. When a reader sort of approaches a book purely for like quick dopamine and easy escapism, then 18th century prose mechanism, dense syntactic structures, long paragraphs, long chapters, or whatever, this creates immediate cognitive friction. It forces the reader to slow down, to look up definitions for things they do not understand, and decipher context. To a reader who is seeking effortless relaxation, that exact fiction feels less like immersive art, less like a process of learning, and more like a burdensome homework given to them by their English professor. The modern consensus isn't that, complex writing is entirely bad. It is just that easy entertainment cannot tolerate such friction, cannot tolerate such dense vocabulary. And when literature is reduced strictly to that bucket, to easy in the bucket of easy entertainment, this use of complexity, complex words becomes the enemy. This push for simpler prose is then further sort of amplified by the gamification of reading. Literature has been transformed into a sport of volume and velocity. Like, how many books can you read in a month? Can you read this 400 page book in a single sitting? Reading speed is celebrated as a feat of cognitive athletic ability. But what is often overlooked in such cases is the basic reality of mechanism. Simple prose will yield faster consumption. The simpler the prose, short chapters, smaller paragraphs, and use of simpler words, and more, perhaps more tell than show. All of these to maintain high volume reading goals and clear massive TBR stacks, readers naturally pivot to such simpler written books. In a landscape where speed is the primary metric of success, complex syntax and dense vocabulary are then not artistic choices, they are structural hurdles. Their very existence will kind of make the book harder for the general audience to, take in. When these two forces align, these two forces, the demand for simpler prose for easy entertainment and demand for simpler prose for easy reading, faster reading, the reader's expectations in such scenario shifts. The author is no longer viewed as an artist that's creating an art for the audience to experience, but they become a supplier that's creating a commodity for the consumer, that's the reader. Under this framework, the burden of effort is transferred entirely onto the writer to ensure that the text is digestible as possible. However, I think in this scenario, dismissing this, all of this as mere reader laziness or lack of effort from the readers is a bit of oversimplification and gives the writer a clean sheet. As a writer, of course, you're free to write purely for the sake of art. But if your goal is connecting with the audience, if your goal is to connect with the readership, if your goal is to communicate a plot, build an arc, or evoke a specific emotion, then you cannot ignore the audience. You cannot ignore the demand of the audience. Clarity is not the enemy of art. In my own fiction, for example, I practice simpler prose because my primary commitment is for sort of narrative precision. My goal is that how I want to write in the simplest form as possible and not always pivot to writing in complex language when it's unnecessary, because I want the reader to understand what I'm trying to say. So the reader should never be left confused simply because the author wanted to parade their own lexicon, to show off their knowledge of vocabulary and language. When complex vocabulary is inserted without any purpose, just for the sake of it, it ceases to be prose and it becomes a performance. We all have encountered this, right? In certain literary fiction, or in academic lecture halls, in academic discussions, where people write or speak by using dense, obscure language to use a point that can be made using just simple vocabulary. In such a scenario, one wonders if choosing a particular very complex word is a choice because it's the exact key to unlock a specific meaning, or is the person just merely flaunting their intelligence, showing off their knowledge? Vocabulary in fiction should never be an act of vanity, it should be an act of manipulation. Consider this example. If you're writing or even translating a story where a modern protagonist goes from their own world and enters this historical world, then your then language in that case becomes your primary visual tool. You can use language to show the difference between the timelines, between the modern world and the historical world. You can have your characters in the historical world talk in very archaic form of English and have a modern protagonist talk in current day English to show the difference between the language. Or even in case of a translation, or let's say from Chinese, Tamil, Hindi, whatever, using archaic or low frequency English in such a scenario, it isn't pretension. It is a deliberate architectural choice to mirror cultural distance and temporal scale. When an ancient king, let's say, speaks in dense, rhythmic, elevator language, or when a historical setting demands this period accurate diction, the complexity serves the immersion. It belongs there. You're supposed to write in a particular format to depict a particular kind of setting. Complexity for the sake of posturing, for the sake of showing off, dilutes the story, but for the sake of immersion, it elevates it. The ultimate goal of vocabulary is not to show the reader what you know, it is to make the reader feel exactly what the story demands. If you want the reader to feel like they have entered a 19th century, 18th century London, at the era of London, then you will write in such a manner that's going to make them feel. If you start writing in like contemporary language while telling them they are in 18th, 19th century England, they're not going to feel it. And the other way around, if you're writing in contemporary times and your language is like 18th, 19th century English, the reader is going to feel misplaced. They'll be like, what I'm reading feels like 18th, 19th century, but you're telling me I'm in contemporary world. Furthermore, in an increasingly globalized world, language do not exist in pockets. Words cross borders and borrow phonetics. Words cross and merge into language, meld together to create new forms of expression. I think this is where modern prose has room to actually truly innovate. Instead of showing off or dusting off archaic vocabulary just for the sake of it, there should be a use of organic multilingual code switching, putting words from other languages into a text written in another language to reflect how people actually speak, think, and say, because a lot of people in current world are cultural people. They bilingual, multilingual, and that I think lends to a cultural texture and grounds world building in a way that feels genuinely lived in. Ultimately, this debate reveals a fundamental shift in the entire literary ecosystem. The relationship between the author and the reader is no more of the artist and the consumer of the experience of the audience. It is between that of a producer and a consumer. And where does this then leave the fate of complex prose? I think the shift needs to come from both the reader's side and the writer's side. For the reader, it's pretty much clear, okay? Curiosity over fiction. Or friction. In an era of, instant sort of information, demanding literature be dumped down is a failure of engagement with the work. Reading is an active process. It should challenge you, expand your horizon, and occasionally slow you down. The next time you encounter an unfamiliar word, don't demand the writer to, discard such a vocabulary or not use it. Look it up, understand its context, and take ownership of expanding your own horizon. And in case you think it's breaking your immersion of reading that text, then you don't necessarily have to look it up the moment you come across it. You can highlight it, note it down, and come back to it later. For the writer, the mandate is equally clear. Posturing should be abandoned. Intent should take over. Indulging in dense vocabulary won't single-handedly, fix some sort of literacy crisis or, cover up your weak storytelling. If you want to introduce complex vocabulary, complex word, or unfamiliar language, do it. Execute it with craftsmanship. Integrate it seamlessly into the narrative structure rather than treating your prose like a dumping ground of a thesaurus. At the end of the day, language is a bridge. It's supposed to connect. It's not a flex. It's not supposed to be shown off. It's not supposed to something that you show off. Use it to pull your reader into the world you're building, not lock them out of it. If you enjoyed this deep dive, consider subscribing and check out the rest of the channel. I'll see you in the next video. And if you are for deeper essays regarding craft of writing, story analysis through modern media, head over to my Substack, Knights of Pendum. Link is in the description. I'll see you in the next video. Until next time, keep theorizing.